Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Peter, a 15-year-old hobbyist game dev.
Yo, wait, this guy's only 15? How the fuck? Hey guys, Peter here. On the last two videos, I had quite a lot of people asking me how I learned to make games at such a young age, and I'm sure half of them didn't even believe I was 15, so I figured it would be best if I made a whole video dedicated to it. I completely get why everyone was asking. I only mentioned it briefly in the first video, and learning to make games is definitely a big challenge. Before I start, I'd quickly like to mention that since the last video I've made a Discord server, but more about that at the end. In the first video, I did briefly mention part of my journey, but realistically, it goes back a bit further than that. I've been interested in coding for a while, and I remember back when I was around 8 learning the basics of Scratch. I obviously don't have any footage from back then, but I seem to remember the first thing I made was literally just a spinning banana. As cringy and embarrassing as most of them were, some of my projects from back then are still uploaded, and I have no idea what my email or password was, so that's sadly not changing anytime soon. My point with that anyway, is that everyone needs to start somewhere, and that going into game dev, I did have a tiny bit of prior coding experience, although it definitely wasn't much. Game development undoubtedly has a fairly steep learning curve, but I've said it to a few people in the comments and I'll say it again. Honestly, YouTube is a great place to start. The internet nowadays has loads of information readily available, and it's absolutely fine to start off by just following tutorials. I started sometime during lockdown, so I must have been around 12 at the time, but I'd been inspired anyhow to start making games because I'd seen a few devlogs on YouTube and I was a bit bored, so I figured there was no harm in trying. The first obstacle I encountered was the editor. I know it varies a bit from engine to engine, but they all have millions of panels with lists and tabs and buttons, and it all looks really daunting. When I was just starting, I had no idea what to even search, and while there are resources available online to help you learn, most of them are super long, and I kind of doubt most beginners want to watch a 75 video long playlist of half-hour tutorials. If making a video which explains the basics of Unity would be helpful, I might do that sometime in the near future, but in order to keep this video on topic, I'll continue with my journey for now. The first thing I recall doing was making a very basic scene containing a ball with a rigid body and a material. I'd say that learning to add components and change values was probably one of the single most important skills I learned, but on its own it wasn't quite enough to make anything interesting. I wasn't really decided on anything specific by that point, so I did as most people probably did and watched a whole bunch of tutorials. You'll get some people online who tell you to stay away from tutorials at all costs, but I think they're being a bit extreme. I'd say that it's perfectly fine so long as you learn something. The main problem is just that blindly following them results in you only knowing very specific skills and not becoming remotely independent. If I was to give some advice, I think you should watch them, but test yourself after each one. Let's say you just watched the tutorial on how to make a 3D character controller. Try to expand on it. See if you can add sprinting, crouching, dashing, double jumping, wall running, or whatever you think is just above your skill level and will provide a good challenge for you. Once you know the basics, it mostly comes down to practice. After some time, you should see yourself becoming less and less reliant on tutorials, and should be able to do basic stuff yourself. I'm not saying that you'll suddenly become some game development guru who hasn't needed the internet in 20 years. I mean, even now that I'm working on my game, I still sometimes watch tutorials on systems I've never used before, advanced custom editors being the most recent example. Another point, don't be afraid to Google things. If you aren't learning something new every project, chances are you're probably doing something wrong, especially towards the start of your journey. Speaking of projects, my next tip would be to start small and to give up on things if necessary. I used to find it a massive struggle to stay committed to a single project, and I still sometimes do. I tried some things in 2D, some things in 3D, some things simple, some things more complex. I'd often have a random idea like, oh, maybe I'll try making a 3D FPS game today, and then realise 2 days later that that's all I had as an idea, and give up straight after making the character controller. In retrospect though, attempting a wide variety of things was actually a good idea. It meant that I got some experience with everything. I had to try pixel art and 3D modelling, single player and multiplayer coding, casual and serious games. And by doing this, you'll learn new techniques, new components, new styles, and you'll eventually discover what you like doing best. On the art side, I have a bit less to say, but I did have a lot of people asking about that too. With that, there was less of a path that I followed. While there certainly are lots of tips and tricks you can follow when learning pixel art, and I do have plans for videos related to that, I'd say that practice, developing a consistent style, and taking inspiration are the three most important things, not only in pixel art, but art in general. I've certainly watched a lot of videos on pixel art, and I'll leave recommendations of a few channels in the description, but honestly, just don't be too harsh with yourself. You'll get better over time. Just because someone else's stuff looks different doesn't mean it's necessarily better. Art is very subjective, and you don't always need to try and recreate reality. Once you have developed a preference and a style, I'd say to try making your first actual project. If you have any sort of ideas, even if they aren't particularly original, I think you should give something a go. If you have most of the skills, the hardest part is really just motivation. The larger the project, the more likely you'll be to give up. And I was probably a bit stupid to make my first commercial project a massive sandbox game, but it's what I find most interesting, and ultimately, if you're learning game development as a hobby, it should remain a hobby. You shouldn't force yourself to do anything if you don't want to, and if you only want to try out random small things, do just that. If you do find yourself in a situation like I did, where you're working on a project which you have any intention of publishing, devlogs can be a great way to promote that. Having a community can be great for motivation, as you have a sense of accountability to release the game, but it's definitely not going to be for everyone. On the topic of community though, a few people suggested a Discord server in the comments of my other videos, and I had already been considering creating one, so I figured now would be the best time to do so. I've created a place for you guys to talk about my game and ask me any questions, so if you are at all interested in the development process, the link is in the description and on my channel page. If you're wondering when the next video is gonna be, the NPCs are taking a bit longer than expected, but it should still only be a few more weeks. If you did enjoy this video, subscribing would of course be appreciated, but that's it for now. See you all in the next one.